I've also been asked to read the scripture passage for today, which comes from Matthew 5, verses 27 to 30, if you wanted to look it up either on your phone or in the Bible that's in the pews. Matthew 5, 27 to 30. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. An admonition from Pastor Phil already mentioned in the e-news. There may be some parts that are not suitable for children, so those who have not gone off to jump, perhaps you may want to think about that or cover their ears. Thank you.
Good morning, ClearView Church. I am coming to you via video today because you may have heard recently I've had surgery. And I thought I probably shouldn't be preaching all hopped up on various drugs. That might not be a pretty sight. You might have some fun with it. Might not be too good for me or for the gospel. But also, it's just really hard to find a guest preacher on a holiday long weekend. So you have me on video instead. But actually, I'm really glad to be able to do this because today we're dealing with strikingly important words from Jesus. Jesus is talking about sex, and it's some of the most personal teaching that Jesus gets into. Jesus is really getting into our business personally here. And I can imagine these words of his are going to generate lots of conversation, and that is a good thing. I hope we have really good, wise conversations. But as we start, I think it's important to note that Jesus here is teaching people who have decided to follow him. Jesus is talking with people who have wrestled with who he is, and they've concluded he is who he says he is. They've decided to let their lives and identity be shaped by himself, his life. And maybe that's not you today. I know we have non-Christians who are exploring faith as part of ClearView, and we love it that you're here. But there's a sense in which you aren't the primary audience for Jesus' teaching here. And I think this is important to note because if someone is not a follower of Jesus, why on earth would they follow any of the teachings of Jesus about any part of their life? And so if you're not a Christian here today, we're glad you're here, and I invite you to sort of overhear this teaching of Jesus, but I urge you to first consider Jesus. Consider who he is. Consider what he said. Consider his death. Consider his resurrection. Those are the vital first questions for you to wrestle with, and then come back to the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus is here talking about sex. Now, people inside and outside the church think Christians just make way too big a deal of sex and sexual sin. And on the one hand, there's good reason to complain about that. But I think there's a strong case for this because sex is important. Just think of it. Sex is the way new life gets created. It's about the creation of new life. It's about the bonding also of two people together in a one flesh union. So that means sex is about love. It's about life. It's about human relationships. It's about human existence. So yeah, this is really important stuff we're dealing with. So I hope you can see why sex is worth making a big deal about. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about life in the kingdom. And this life that Jesus is talking about, it's not some otherworldly thing that happens after you die. It's about a flourishing life here and now. And so it includes our bodies. And so, of course, God's kingdom, the reality of God's kingdom, God's life would touch at the most basic level of our human experience, including our sexuality. And we find here in Jesus' teaching on sex, I think, some of the most encompassing, hopeful, honest views of human sexuality. If I had to summarize this teaching of Jesus in 2 words, I'd choose these 2: beautiful and broken. Human sexuality, as we know it, is both stunningly beautiful and unbelievably broken. And Jesus shows us how in God's kingdom, our sexuality is meant to be restored to that original beauty, fully realized in all its glory and wonder. But Jesus begins to teach about sex by naming the broken reality. And there's something beautiful in this, because right away you see the care of Jesus. Here we see Jesus, our protector, the one who cares about our tenderest human realities, our sexuality. Here's Jesus who protects the integrity of persons in what is likely the most vulnerable, intimate act that humans participate in. And he says, "You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So Jesus is right up front saying there's brokenness in human sexuality, and he names it. It's lust. Now, people today hear that and they think, oh, please, lust? Really? Isn't that all Victorian Jesus? Haven't we matured beyond that sort of stereotype of sexuality? Come on, Jesus, we're big kids now. We're in control of our bodies. Sex is not something we really struggle with. And I think Jesus would want to say here, let's press the pause button. How about we stop and just think about that? And while some might judge Jesus' words as prudish or harshly conservative, it's strange to see, I think it's interesting to see how so many voices today are catching up to this word of caution Jesus is giving. There was recently a small Hollywood movie, wasn't a big splash at all, but it was a release called Don John. And the striking thing about this film is that it shows all that has been lost in our sex-saturated culture. It's the story of a young man in New York who tries to bed every woman that he can every night, and he's addicted to pornography. But it doesn't glorify that life at all. It's a hard, honest look at how out of control sexuality has become, and it looks at everything that is lost because of that out of control sexuality. Or you might want to consider a noted feminist author, Naomi Wolf. She wrote a piece in the New York Times about the deep problems of lust as it gets embodied in pornography. And she writes that the power and charge of sex are maintained when there is some sacredness to it. When there's sacredness to it. In our culture, we've been deceived to think we're sexually liberated when in fact everyone is stuck. We're realizing we're not in control, and we're experiencing every form of brokenness because of it. Why? Because we don't have a big enough, a high enough view of sex. We don't understand its power. Listen to what a philosopher and author, Wendell Berry, writes. He says, sexual liberation ought to logically have brought in a time of naturalness, of ease and candor between men and women. But he writes, it has, on the contrary, filled the country with sexual self-consciousness, with uncertainty and fear. Women hurry along our city streets and public corridors with their eyes averted like hunted animals. Eye contact, which was once a very signature of our humanity, has become a danger. We are now living in a sexual atmosphere so polluted and embittered that women must look on virtually any man as a potential assailant, and a man must look on virtually any woman as a potential accuser. And then he concludes, and we presume to teach our young people that sex can be made safe by the use of purchased drugs and devices. What a lie! Sex was never safe, and it is less safe now than it has ever been. Those are compelling words. Because the problem today is not that we have too high a view of sex, but that we have such a low view of it. Our culture is so naive about it. Sex is not safe. We don't understand its power. This is what Jesus is getting at here. In this passage, Jesus uses an image that I think can make a lot of people sort of choke. He talks about hell. And some people think, oh, of course, you uptight Christians, any sexual misdemeanor and it's burn in hell for that, right? But that's not the case here. Jesus is showing us something about the power of sex. Now, he uses a very specific word that gets translated as hell. The word is Gehenna. And this was the garbage dump in Jerusalem. It was the place filled with things that were rotting and decaying. It was where garbage was burned. And it is a picture of just decomposition, of decay. And Jesus is not saying that our sexual sins damn us forever. Instead, he's giving us a picture of what happens when we diminish sex, when we treat it as something less than it is. He shows us how unbridled sex leads to disintegration, to decay of the very person involved. Sex is so mysterious and beautiful. It is so unique, so untamable. And yet, because we have such a low view of it, treating it so casually, our lives fall apart because of that. We don't have a high enough view, a glorious enough view of sex. And so our cultural conversation about sex, I find, is simply not honest. People today often say that, for instance, sex, it's just an appetite I have. It's a biological instinct. But come on, that can't be. Because look at the reactions people have towards sex, the strong reactions. Think of the profound wounds and lasting scars it can leave in people's lives. This is not merely a biological appetite. Or some say it's just another part of life. You know, I go out to eat, I work out, I hang out with my friends, I enjoy recreational sex. Why make such a big deal of it? But again, really? Why do we give such inordinate attention to sex, to intimate and romantic love? Think of all the songs that are devoted to sexual romantic love. How many of our songs are focused on, say, our studies, or commuting, or cooking? They're not, are they? Why? Because this is not the same as any other part of life. This is not merely an appetite. We are dealing here with a powerful part of human life. So, what then is Jesus talking about when he talks of lust? And I think the first thing we need to name is that Jesus is acknowledging the goodness of sex and sexual desire. Because you can't name lust as destructive or disordered sexuality unless there is, first of all, a well-ordered and a beautiful form to which lust never measures up to. And so when Jesus says anyone who looks lustfully, he's not talking about sexual desire in general. There are many words that Jesus could have used for that, but he's using a specific word to talk about a disordered sexuality. The Bible doesn't define lust as sexual desire. It's not the same thing. Jesus is not saying sexual desire is wrong, which is good news, isn't it? Because all of us feel sexual desire within us. It's part of our bodies that God created as good. So lust is also not the appreciative glance of someone beautiful. Please never think that you can't look at someone with just great appreciation for their beauty, for their stature. I think that's how we're created. The Bible's attitude towards sex is really such an open and embracing perspective. It's an exuberant rejoicing in sexual pleasure that makes even the most sophisticated person in our world today blush. For instance, look at Genesis chapter 1. When God creates humanity, he creates us male and female, and he creates us as sexual beings. And think of what was one of the first commands of God to the human pair. God says, enjoy sex together, be fruitful and multiply. And God calls all of this good. And then in Genesis 2, we see Adam and Eve who are placed together in the garden. You have naked Adam beside naked Eve. Adam sees naked Eve for the first time. And what does he do? He breaks out into history's first love song, into a poem. This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, he says. And God looks upon that naked pair enjoying one another together. And God is not thinking, oh my goodness, whatever are these two getting up to? Not at all. God blesses it. He calls it good. I encourage you to read the book of Song of Solomon. It's also called Song of Songs. Whenever I do premarital counseling, I tell couples that's the book to read on your honeymoon, because it is this extended celebration of sexual love. Its attitude is fierce and unblushing. There is absolutely nothing shy or ashamed there at all. And we think, in all our frank and blunt talk on sex in our culture, that we're being honest. But we just don't acknowledge the power of sex and desire that God has given. We actually trivialize it, diminish it. And in what Jesus is saying here in the Sermon on the Mount, he's not laying down some random commandments intended, to drain all the fun out of life and to make things just really difficult and hard. Jesus intends for us to find full life. He wants us to find and experience a gloriously full sexual life that God created us to enjoy. So Jesus lays before us the way of living with a powerful view of sexuality. He's not saying, stuff down all those sexual desires, but he's actually recognizing the goodness of sexual desire, and he wants to protect it. So Jesus says, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. I say to you, however, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully commits adultery with her in his heart. And he's calling out people of his day who thought, if I just sleep in the right bed, I'm okay. I've fulfilled God's law. Now, that in itself is important, okay? Let's never diminish the simple goodness of sexual faithfulness. But Jesus is giving a more comprehensive understanding of sexuality that applies now not only to married people, but also to unmarried as well. Think of it for a moment. How does someone end up in bed with a person whom with they do not share a covenant commitment? They don't wake up one day and think, well, I wonder what I'm going to get up to today. No. How someone ends up in adultery instead is a lengthy process of thought, of imagination in their heart that then comes to fruition in them sleeping with someone who's not their covenant partner. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's sort of going upstream from the act of adultery, and he's moving towards the core issues, which is heart issues. Jesus is opening up sex as a whole person, unifying, integrative act, and he names lust as both impersonal and a disordered sexual desire. See, if you want sex, if you want to be physically naked and vulnerable with someone that you are not willing to be legally, economically, personally naked and vulnerable with, what you're doing essentially is splitting the body and the soul. Because remember, sex is a whole person unifying act. It involves all of us. And so lust is an impersonal sexual desire that really makes the other person secondary to getting what I want. It doesn't honor the fullness of sex, and it alienates people from themselves, which really runs counter to what sex is about. Sex is unifying, not alienating. And so lust makes us less human. And unless you're willing to make a complete personal commitment to somebody from whom you are asking a complete bodily commitment, you're not really after that person. You probably don't want them as a person. You want an experience, and that person is a necessary commodity. You're dehumanizing that person, and they're probably using you. Which is why I think Jesus is so forceful here. He is protecting our dignity as persons, as image bearers of God. Lust is impersonal, and it is a disordered sexual desire. The word that Jesus uses for lust here is a rarely used word for sexual desire. The word means over desire. And it's a really strong word that has the feel of needing to possess something. Lust, this over desire, moves from appreciation to this need to possess. And the problem with lust is it must have its object. And it actually has strong connections to what the Bible calls idolatry. So this word essentially describes how we take something good, sexual desire, and we try to get from it what you can only get from God. Jesus is saying here, there are deeply spiritual realities to sex. And I think that helps us explain why we're so compelled by sexual desire, why people will sometimes sacrifice parts of themselves to have sex. Because we are driven to find in sex what only God can give us. There's a song by Bruno Mars. It's called Locked Out of Heaven. And I think it's probably one of the clearest articulations of the power of sex, of how we seek out from sex what only God can provide. It's like we keep pushing the sex button in the hope that a little intimacy and maybe more meaning and some transcendence might finally dribble out. But it's all in vain. We look to sexual and romantic love to heal that core need of acceptance, that need we have for approval. But there's only one who can love you unconditionally, who can satisfy what your heart most deeply desires. And until you find God to be the lover of your soul, you will not be a fit lover of anyone else. You'll be trying to get out of that person what only God can give you. And these good desires we have for tenderness, to be held, for beauty, all these sexual desires, they are pointers to God. And lust is a signal you haven't paid attention to some deeper longings in your life. So if you see yourself here at all on what I've been talking about, this isn't meant to beat yourself up. Instead of beating yourselves up about it, recognize that lust that grips our life is really an indication that you've lost touch with larger, deeper, good, holy longings for God. Ultimately, since these longings are only fulfilled in God, lust is a sign that we've drifted out of intimacy in our relationship with God, or that relationship with God is simply missing. It's remarkable when you read the Bible and hear it speak of our relationship to God. It talks about very intimate, very relational language. God does not want simply to be your Lord, but your lover too. Think of this. The gospel tells us that God, through Jesus, gives us perfect approval and acceptance. God finds you radiant, beautiful, ravishing. Do you believe that? To the degree that you experience that, God's love for you, will you be able to understand and deal well and wisely with sex? Because then it won't control your life. It won't crush your spouse under your needs and expectations to be everything for them. You won't get all anxious when you don't have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or if you gain weight, because your heart is satisfied in God's acceptance and love. Now, we could dive so much deeper into this, and I really hope you do in your life groups. But to wrap up, let me offer just a few closing thoughts. I'm not sure we can resurrect the word, but let's at least pursue the virtue of chastity. I know, such an archaic sounding word, right? But such a life-giving virtue. It's not a prudish list of sexual don'ts, but it is a pro-love, pro-person virtue and lifestyle. And it's not just for single people either. It's a quality of one's character. It's the outlook of a human being, whether you're single or married, that allows you to selflessly appreciate good and attractive things, yes, even human bodies, by keeping those goods ordered to the good of the whole person and ordered to our calling to love one another. Chastity's fundamental question is not, how far can I go before I cross whatever line there is? But rather, chastity asks, how can my life, my thoughts, my desires, my choices, my emotional responses, my conversations, what I wear, how I behave, how can all of these make me a person who is best prepared to give and receive love in relationship with others? So let's rehabilitate chastity as a virtue all of us can pursue together. And secondly, let's remember that the Sermon on the Mount is written to a community. Realize that the kingdom life that God offers to us, it's not solitary, but it's one in community. We need each other. And we need to affirm this in church. We can't do this alone, especially in our hyper-sexually charged culture. You know, the early church was really a countercultural community. It presented to the Roman Empire of that time a unique view of what God's kingdom was like. The early church, they lived in a culture that was pretty stingy with its money, but very promiscuous with its bodies. But the early church was almost exact opposite. It was promiscuous and generous with its money, but it was very self-controlled with their bodies. And the challenge for us today is, how might we be a unique community in our time, in our sexually charged culture? How can we be a healing community for all the sexual brokenness that happens around us? How can we begin to have honest and frank conversations about our bodies, about our desires, trusting that Jesus knows these struggles? And I think this word of Jesus, it calls from a swift and decisive action. Jesus ends this way. He says, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Now, this is hyperbole, okay? Let's be clear. Jesus is not advocating self-mutilation, but he is calling us to urgent, forceful action on this. And for many of us here, it's not about a hand or an eye, but it's about this thing, our phones. And if this thing is leading you down a path, a certain path towards lust, can I be frank? Throw the bloody thing away. Really. Jesus is saying, friends, the moment is now. The issue is dire and the stakes are high. So what will you do about it? Can we as a community of disciples be a healing community in a sexually broken and disordered world? Can we together show the way for what respectful relationships look like, to demonstrate what real love looks like? God's desire for you is so much more. Jesus' love is stronger than any addiction you have, greater than any harm you've experienced. And Jesus is committed to sexual healing and restoration. So friends, look to Jesus today. No matter what has happened in your past, no matter what sexual harm or how much promiscuity has just marked your life, look to Jesus today for this healing. No matter how much sexual repression you've experienced in your life, no matter how awkward you feel about your body and about your sexual desires, look to Jesus for this healing so that you might experience flourishing life.